Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the fourth session of the Community Emergency Preparedness webinar series, Identifying and Accessing Resources to Address Potential Consequences of Agricultural Emergencies. And agricultural emergencies have made headlines this past month. Those near Burlington may have heard of the heifers that made their escape destination when they bolted from their pasture the median of Interstate 89. That was quite an event. Then there was the double-decker livestock trailer in Delaware that flipped over going off an interstate exit ramp, and they lost 23 of 42 head of Holstein heifers that were intended to go to Jordan for joining the herd in Jordan, the country of Jordan. And then some of you may have noted that there's flooding out in western Canada, and the flooding got so bad that a major packing plant, the Cargill plant up there, has closed for a period of time. And then on the animal disease side, we have an epidemic of porcine epidemic diarrhea traveling through herds in the Midwest. And while this isn't considered a disease emergency of the scale of something like foot and mouth disease that would cause trade issues, it certainly is a disaster for the facilities that are impacted with their, where young piglets are impacted. The purpose of this session is to go over how to identify and catalog resources to bolster local emergency preparedness for agricultural and other emergencies. Welcome back. This is Dr. Julie Smith, UVM Extension Dairy Specialist, Vermont's point of contact to the Extension Disaster Education Network. I appreciate having the opportunity to share some of what I have learned about agricultural emergency management over the past 5 years or so. And I also look forward to your comments and input during the session, so don't hold back. And if you wouldn't mind, to help me track attendance, please type your email into the chat box. Today I will review or help you understand what types of resources can be listed in a plan. I'll let you compare those with what's already in your plans and encourage you to review and revise your local plans in coming months. So here's my yes/no question. For those of you watching the webinar, were you able to locate a local support function in this past week? And if you have, would you check on the green check mark over the participant box? I had one sent to me, so we will be discussing some findings of that local support function. What we're going to cover builds on the capability-based planning approach introduced in the June 18th webinar. We'll start with a quick review. The emergency planning process flows from identifying capabilities to address consequences of realized vulnerabilities, to defining tasks, to achieve the necessary capabilities, then securing resources needed to complete the tasks. These should be in your plan, which should be exercised to ensure it is up to date. So it's a three-step process. First, identify needed capabilities. Second, figure out what tasks are needed to achieve those capabilities. And what we're going to focus on today is the third step, finding the resources needed to accomplish the tasks to address the situation at hand. Just a review from last time, due to cost constraints and practical limitations, no community can develop every capability, task, or have every resource. What to do? Develop capabilities prioritized according to locally identified vulnerabilities. There may be some gaps. What about those? This is where mutual aid or other prearranged agreements or the common practices used to request resources when local resources are exhausted should be followed. Pre-planning how to do that is really important to enhance response efforts and results in the efficient use of resources and distribution of responsibilities. Local jurisdictions have existing emergency operations plans and work within an existing emergency management system. So all agricultural emergency preparedness efforts need to work within the existing plans and systems. Also from last week, let's review the connection between capabilities and tasks. For those of you with Incident Command System, ICS training, it may be helpful to think of capabilities as corollaries of objectives. How to accomplish the objective involves choosing a strategy and associated tactics. From my perspective, tasks and tactics can be viewed as synonymous. Remember, there's more than one way to skin a cat. The strategy you choose to meet your objective should be informed by your knowledge of available resources. These resources can then be assigned to specific tasks. It's very likely that more than one task will be required to achieve an objective. It's not necessarily 3, it's 1 or more. So what do we mean by a capability? A capability is the ability to perform certain actions. Or, for those of you with ICS training, a capability is the ability to meet specific incident objectives. A capability describes, or an objective describes what needs to be done. What needs to be done, not how to do it. A capability framed as an objective is what would go on ICS Form 202. During an incident, these would need to be specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-sensitive, SMART objectives. But for planning purposes, these can be more general. Let's go over what is a task. Tasks are specific, discrete actions that individuals or teams must complete to successfully carry out a capability. Successful execution of tasks allows for the accomplishment of capabilities. Last time we came up with a list of tasks that would need to be done to put out the fire. These tasks may be finding water, fighting the fire, controlling traffic. In a different scenario of evacuating livestock in a flood situation, we identified potential tasks as loading and unloading animals, establishing the route, the evacuation route, the destination, where is the shelter point, how are we going to feed and water the animals. So we've got down to the tasks. Now we're going to take a look at resources. And resources are associated with tasks. A resource can be a person, a team, or a thing that is needed to complete a task. Resources include personnel, equipment, supplies, and facilities. And these resources support the tasks and capabilities required to prevent, mitigate, protect against, respond to, and recover from an incident. On the left-hand side of this slide is a list of kinds of resources. These are the kinds of resources that are referred to in Independent Study 703A, the National Incident Management System, NIMS, Resource Management course. And applying this to an example of rescuing a horse fallen into a ravine, it may require mobilizing several kinds of resources. And actually, the particular kind of resource, a team, would bring along many other kinds of resources with it. So if you call upon your technical rescue team, your expectation is it will come with the appropriate personnel, come with appropriate equipment, mobile trailer carrying a rescue sling, and have personnel and supplies needed to administer sedatives or other drugs to a potentially injured or anxious animal. Why is it important to think about kinds and types of resources? So I decided to take an example from everyday life that would help make some sense of it. You can't just send someone out for ice cream without defining the shape, flavor, and size of what you want, right? Those shapes, flavors, and sizes of ice cream treats are similar to categories, kinds, and types of resources when we're talking about emergency management. The whole point of the National Incident Management System is to provide a consistent nationwide approach and vocabulary for multiple agencies or jurisdictions to work together so they can build, sustain, and deliver the core capabilities needed to achieve a secure and resilient nation. Don't you love the lofty language there? Key word in there was vocabulary. So through NIMS and ICS, they've developed their own vocabulary, their own set of terminologies. And yet the terminology that we use at the local level when we're supposedly communicating in plain English can get us in trouble sometimes. When it comes to ordering resources, for example, you need to make sure that what you order is, that what you get is what you wanted, right? So this is an example I like to use. If someone orders a tanker, which one are they going to get? All of these come up when you do a search for tanker. So it may depend on where the person receiving the request is located, what they perceive as a tanker. Or maybe it means that we have to change how we order resources when we're going to that level. And instead of ordering a tanker, you need to specify that you need the capability to move 30,000 gallons of water from point A to point B in such and such a time frame. And that allows the folks that are identifying and securing resources full flexibility to get whatever they can find that can meet that capability. What are categories of resources? The categories describe the function of the resource, and there's some, I don't know, I counted them earlier, but there's some 15 or so listed here. And some of them line up very nicely with local emergency response agencies. You've got firefighting, law enforcement, health and medical. Hazmat teams are common, so we've got hazardous materials response. But note on this list, animal and agricultural issues is a category of resource, which was interesting to note from my perspective. And if you look at kinds of resources, again, kinds listed on the left here, these include personnel, teams, facilities, equipment, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies. And what I want to comment on here is that there's also typing. And while typing is not required at the local level, if you need to order a particular kind of resource and you know what it is that you need and you're ordering it from the state or federal level, you'll want to know what type to order. So FEMA has typed numerous resources, and those lists are available. And it's simply a specific uniform way of describing resources so that interagency, interjurisdiction requests can be made efficiently. What I've got here on the right are some types of resources found in FEMA's type definitions of animal health resources, and actually the one that I looked up was the large animal sheltering team. So actually the type is large animal sheltering team, and that type of resource is made up of several kinds of resources. So a veterinarian and other personnel are part of the team. There are specified communications, supplies, and vehicles that would come with the team. And actually the description of the team also includes not only the number and training of personnel, but the length of deployment capability, how long they can come out and help you. Is it 3 days, a week, 2 weeks? And what equipment and supplies they're going to come with. Any questions on that? If you have a question at any time, just raise your hand and Lucy can notify me that there's a question waiting. Here in Vermont, at the town level, our basic emergency operations plans, or BOPs, have resource annexes. And these are called local support functions. They line up numerically with the support functions at the state level, which line up numerically with the support functions at the federal level, the emergency support functions. So when we're looking at local support function 11, this is the one that lines up with dealing with agriculture and natural resources, as well as cultural and historic resources issues in terms of emergency management. And you'll find on these local support functions a listing of state and regional contacts, folks who have authority information that would be helpful to a response. You'll find local professionals listed on the LSF-11. A number of local veterinarians will be listed, and it usually will indicate whether their practice is small animal or large animal. And you may find some other information or identification of resources that would be helpful. And the contact info includes the agency or agency name or title associated with the individual, and their name and number are listed there. What I'm curious about, and we don't have yet, I believe, any of our local or regional planners on today, but I was curious how the process works in Vermont in terms of updating annexes. I know I've been involved in the process a couple times in the last few years and was able to help the Cornwall EMD update LSF-11 for that town following our last webinar. So certainly that's something that we need to do. The folks in our state agencies do change, and even folks in our neighborhoods change. Folks retire, new folks move in. We need to make sure these annexes are up to date. And I'm trying to see what page I'm on. Here we go. So when you look at a local support function in Vermont, you're likely to find two kinds of resources listed, and those would be personnel and teams. So a lot of individuals, state agency contacts, veterinarians, and the large animal technical rescue team will be noted. Other resources I haven't seen. I haven't seen equipment, supplies, facilities, vehicles listed, and I'm curious why that is. So I'll follow up with some folks after this webinar and get some insight into that. It may be that those kinds of resources show up on other LSFs, and that's adequate for the town, that they have a whole complement of their LSFs and they know where to find different kinds of resources to address the issue at hand. So the what is missing question has to do with, have we thought through all of the resource requirements that might be needed for an agricultural incident scenario, for instance? So what is recommended is called a gap analysis. So a gap analysis is simply a method, an approach to comparing what the current status is, what are your current resources, with what you might need. And is there anything needed, potentially needed, that you don't have? And then you can think about, is it something you need to get? Is it something that you want to stockpile? Are you concerned that you may have limited ability to get that resource just in time, so it may be advisable to stockpile some inventory? Or identify exactly where you can access that resource. You know, maybe it's a supply, maybe there's a number of different distributors, and you can have those on a list so you can access the resource. If one is sold out, you've got alternate sources. It's also important to know the pathway for requesting resources outside of your own jurisdiction. And we have a way of doing that in Vermont, and so it's important to exercise that and make sure that everyone is familiar with how that process works. And think through what would happen if you're in a situation where you think multiple jurisdictions might be calling on the same resource. Maybe it's the same state level person who has authority over a certain area and needs to help determine which way, which strategy you're using to deal with something. How would they handle those multiple requests at one time, and what do folks at the local level need to know to be prepared for that? Let's take an example, and I don't know if so I just put in the chat box a link to a story about the livestock that made it to the interstate median. So here's our example that you've identified a need to address loose livestock in your town. And it really doesn't matter whether they're loose because of a trailer accident or a broken fence, they broke through the fence, or someone left the gate open. That doesn't matter. One of the needed capabilities would be a way of corralling the livestock. This could be accomplished. What's the task? It could be accomplished by setting up livestock panels, which would require the resources of livestock panels, a vehicle to get them to the accident site, and personnel familiar with setting them up and handling livestock. Let's take another example. What if your town had to provide control area security and traffic checkpoint support? So let's say there was something, some animal disease emergency, foot and mouth disease or some other foreign disease emergency. There's a major control area around the affected premises, whether that's one or multiple sites involved. And traffic control is something that local resources would be called on to assist with. What resources would a town need to supply? So here's where anyone who's on can type in the chat box, what are local resources that would be called into play to control traffic in such a situation? Martha's typing. All right, so obviously our local emergency responders, law enforcement, firefighters, these folks could be called out. They're experienced with traffic control. Is there an auxiliary police? In Vermont, is there a CERT team? These folks are experienced in traffic control. The situation will be quite different from what these folks are used to responding to. They may need to learn have some just-in-time training about biosecurity and how to make sure they don't inadvertently spread disease from one place to another. But they're qualified to do traffic control, and they would be called on to do that. So why create a resource inventory? Why do we have to write it down? Why can't we just go around? Because we're in small towns in Vermont. People know everybody. They know who to call. Well, we already identified that on our local support functions, we have some folks on the list who we may not know real well. We have some state resources listed there. So we need to know who they are, how to get a hold of them. And we need to have multiple people in the town who have access to that resource list. You know, I did a training at a town officers education conference, and I had a local emergency management director there. And we had this conversation. He's like, well, I know everybody. I know where to get the resource. And I said, yeah, that's great, but do you ever take a vacation? Do you ever worry that you might have a surgery scheduled and be in the hospital and not able to tell people who they should call? So this is why it's really important to get that written down and make sure that it's not just in the hands of one person, but that your emergency management director, your select board chair, whoever your third line person is, have that in hand, not just electronic. What if the power's out? So they need to have it accessible and hopefully relatively up to date. You know, we know the day after we finish the update, something may change, so it's a little out of date. So we need to keep it up to date within reason. So put it on a schedule, whether that's every year, every 6 months, whatever makes sense to your town to get that up to date. And it's certainly handy to have that list so you're not worried about thinking straight in an emergency. I mean, when you're under stress, you don't want one more thing that you have to worry about. You might as well have that list at your fingertips. So what I want to show here is an example of a resource inventory sheet. This form was developed by the Strengthening Community Agro-Security Preparedness Program, and it's something you can take it or leave it. It's just an example, and there are a number of fields on here. So it has the resource category or type or kind, excuse me, a specific description, a location, GPS. That could be helpful in some situations. A comment whether there is an MOU with this organization. Where is the contract filed? When was this updated? And of course the contact name, number, email information, and then a descriptor. I like this. So it explains what the capability of this resource is. So this is an animal shelter that has a capacity of 30 dogs and 50 cats. And it explains how much feed is available on site and that their staff is part-time. So that's all helpful information, right? And it's quite a bit more detailed than what's maintained in most of our local support functions in Vermont. So you got to think about, is this information that we want to have available to our local towns? Would this be a benefit? And how would we go about putting this information together? And maybe there's additional information that you'd like to capture that's not on this form. So you can do what you want with your resource catalog, your resource annex. If you want appendices to it, great. Maybe there's multiple things you want. You can create this form in a spreadsheet and then print them out, put them in your binder. So it's pretty flexible. Do what you need to do. This webinar doesn't cover the full gamut of resource management. The full gamut is shown here in this little flowchart. So there's a lot of steps if you're doing resource management during an incident. You've got to identify what's needed, order and acquire the resources, mobilize resources, track resources, recover and demobilize. Does someone need reimbursed? And then you've got inventory, make sure everything came back. And the inventory also refers to what's on your resource inventory list to start with. And that's what we've focused on in this webinar, is how do you create, build, improve on your local resource annex, your resource inventory. And maybe you want to make sure that all of the resources listed know that they're listed in your plan, especially veterinarians. It might be helpful to have a conversation with your local veterinarian and find out what their capabilities are. Would they be willing to come out in an emergency? What are the terms of that? Would they be submitting a bill afterwards? Would they, consider offering services up to a certain point free of charge? How would that work? Maybe there's other resources that would come in handy. The incident on I-89 here in Colchester, they were pretty lucky that the farmer had panels that he could pick up and take to the site. Not every farm has those portable gates or panels that they can move and set up somewhere else. So it's important to know who has them and what it would take to contact that person and bring them to the scene. At this point, we're about ready to wrap up our lesson on building a resource inventory. So let's review our progress with the steps for developing a local animal or agriculture plan. We started by identifying a capability needed in a response. Then we itemized the tasks that would be needed to accomplish or achieve that capability. In this lesson, we identified resources needed to do those tasks. And we talked about conducting a gap analysis, perhaps an exercise to determine if resources would be needed that are not available within the jurisdiction. These steps would feed into the development of a comprehensive plan that would need exercised. And I think at the local level in Vermont, the most critical step really is creating and maintaining a resource list. In summary, resources include personnel, equipment, supplies, and facilities needed to carry out the tasks to meet objectives of any emergency management mission area. Resource annexes or inventories should be readily accessible, even when the power is out, and relatively up to date at all times. Think out of the box. Brainstorm, conduct gap analyses, work through tabletop exercises. The town garage may not have all the equipment you need. So you need to figure out how you can access additional resources when needed. Today's webinar is brought to you with support from University of Vermont Extension and a grant from the USDA NIFA Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. If you'd like to get in touch with me later, my email was in the chat box earlier, or you can Google my blog site. That's where recordings of the webinars will be posted. I'd like to thank you all for participating in the first month of the Community Emergency Preparedness webinar series, and we look forward to continuing this series in the future with input from you on what topics you would like to see included. A survey will be coming out soon, and we look forward to your feedback and your participation in future webinars. Thanks again for being on today.